Welcome to the CSAE Research Podcasts, a series of conversations about research taking place at the Centre for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. I'm Rocco, Zizzamia, a postdoctoral researcher at the CSAE, based in the Department of Economics and an affiliate at the Southern African Labour and Development Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. Today I'll be speaking with Ihsaan Bassier about a paper titled Locked Down and Locked Out, Repurposing Social Assistance as Emergency Relief to Informal Workers, which is joint work between me, Ihsaan, Josh Budlander, Vimal Ranchard and Murray Leibrand, all three of them at Sulgrew at the University of Cape Town. It was published in World Development in 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic presented a particular challenge to countries with high levels of labour market informality. Informal workers and their households were especially vulnerable to the negative economic consequences of the pandemic and associated lockdown measures, while the very fact of their informality made it difficult for governments to quickly provide targeted economic relief. Using South Africa as a case study, our project examined how an established social assistance system, not originally designed to support informal workers, can be repurposed to provide emergency relief to these workers and to their households. So joining me today to discuss this project is Ihsaan Bassier. Ihsaan is an assistant professor at the University of Surrey School of Economics and also an affiliate at Sulgrew at the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Ihsaan.
Thank you. Very happy to be in conversation with you, Rocco.
Likewise. So I had a great day today rereading our paper from 2020, which was a surreal time to be working on something of huge policy importance in South Africa, in a moment of unprecedented urgency, and I think we all felt like very swept up by that. And so let's start discussing the paper. Do you want to kick us off and tell us a little bit about the backstory of this paper, the context in which a demand for the paper emerged, and what we set about trying to do?
Yeah, I think you'll remember even better than me, so please take over whenever you can. But I remember the kind of hysteria and confusion and overwhelming sense of what's going to happen across the world when people realized that COVID was a global pandemic, and this was March, and I was doing my PhD in the US, and Joshua Budlander was also similar. Was one of the authors of the paper, and we sort of came back to South Africa at that point, very late March, just before the lockdown kicked in, but thinking this is a moment which we should be doing something, and I think we were all talking together, all of us that ended up being the co-authors on the project, so with you and with Murray Leibrand and Tim Ranchard. And if I recall correctly, I mean, part of it was us just sort of emailing around and asking because we'd had some projects with the National Treasury unrelated to this, and so we had a few people that we knew there, just emailing them saying, "Look, is there something we can do? Is there something that the government, we've got some skills as PhD students, economists, and is there anything we can do?" And they came back saying, yes, actually, we're thinking of doing some sort of social assistance program, because it's going to be a huge disaster, especially for informal workers in South Africa. And they put us in contact with especially Kate Phillip, who was working in the presidency unit, so not in Treasury. And very quickly, all of us together started working together on this project, if that's the right timeline, Rocco, that I remember. Yeah. And it was crazy, because it was a lot of intense work, and it was a lot of sort of almost, in my mind, and I think for all of us, existential pressure, because for the first time we knew we were doing something that was going to impact in an extremely real way on the country on a huge scale, because we were talking about a grant that will be rolled out to at least several million people across the country, and that would be implemented within weeks. And in fact, as we were working on the project, we could see national updates happening as part of the COVID updates, and the president sort of promising that this was in the works. And a promise based on something that we'd sent on email, 1 a.m. the night before, and it was madness. And we'd come up with some results, and we'd just take it to policymakers. But of course, the policymakers are so diverse and have so many different views. There's Treasury, which needs to think about the budget. There's the presidency, which is trying to kind of think about the bigger picture. There's Department of Social Development, which is particularly thinking of the existing social grants. There's the general kind of, how will people react to these things, to a kind of a new grant? Is it a new grant? Is it a continuation of old grants? How is that going to affect things going forward after the pandemic? And so all these questions, which I'm sure we're going to get into really a lot later, was just, there in a very intense way, all within a few weeks. And then it was sort of over very quickly. And we hope that we did something useful.
I mean, so as academics, and especially as very young academics, the original motivation was always, maybe there's a slim hope that something that we do will have some like on the margin, some impact in how policy is made, to make people better off in some way. And suddenly it was very clear to us that like link between research and policy was suddenly like more relevant than or much more tangible than we could ever have imagined, probably ever will be again in our lives. And I just remember these flurries of emails between us and Kate Phillip, and knowing that then Kate Phillip was speaking to presidency and people at the very highest levels of policymaking in South Africa, and we were just waiting with bated breath, watching Cyril Ramaphosa do those state of the weekly COVID addresses on Sunday evenings to the country, and waiting for him to say something about social protection. And I mean, just to fast forward, I think for the listeners, eventually, I mean, it felt at the time like forever that it took for the government to make a decision about increases to social grants. But about 5 weeks, I think, after the lockdown was first announced, Cyril Ramaphosa, on one of those addresses, did announce that they would be doing three things, right? They would be topping up the child support grant, which is we'll get into the details now. They would be topping up the pension, the old age pension grant, and introducing a new social relief of distress grant, which would be much broader than any of the other grants that exist in South Africa at the moment, or up until that point in their coverage. So, anything to add to that?
Maybe we should just give the bare facts of that. I think 6 months afterwards, the top ups to the existing grants, which is the child support grant and the old age pension, that was discontinued. But more or less, since that very beginning, with a couple of exceptions, a few months, which we'll get into later, the COVID social relief of distress grant, which has morphed basically into what people commonly call a sort of unemployment grant, and that has continued. And although the rhetoric continues to say that this is a temporary grant, most people would say that this is a grant that is now here to stay.
Yeah. So maybe just for listeners, let's sketch out a little bit the like social assistance, social grant landscape in South Africa. So South Africa pays out the value of grants in South Africa is around 3 to 4% of GDP per year. 1/3 of South Africans receive before COVID, one third of South Africans received some form of grant, and most of these was child support grants, which are small in value, so around £20 purchasing power parity, $20 purchasing power parity a month, which is far below national minimum wage, to mothers of children below the age of, who have children below the age of 18. In addition to the child support grant, there was the state old age pension, which had much looser eligibility criteria, but anyone over the age of 60 was eligible for an old age pension, much more generous pension, and disability grants, which are about the same amount as old age pensions. And taking these three grants together, about one third of the South African population was covered by grants before COVID hit. At the same time, South Africa, is an economy with a large share of the population in formal employment, unlike many other countries in South Africa where the formal sector is very small. Of course, there's massive unemployment in South Africa. So I think even before COVID hit, we could think of adults in South Africa being in three broad states, either receiving some income directly from the state through a social through a state grant, either the pension or the child support grant, or being employed in some way. That could be either formal or informal employment, or fully unemployed. And I think people were writing about this and thinking about it before COVID happened, that there's sort of this gap in livelihoods for adults in South Africa, where for large swathes of the population, adults are neither employed nor have access to some social grant, and sort of fall through the gaps in that way, and their livelihoods really depend on redistribution that happens through informal channels. So it's living in a household with somebody else who either has a grant or who has formal employment, or receiving remittances from other households. So, and the sort of working assumption of the South African social assistance regime is that if you're not employed, if you're an able-bodied adult who is not employed, usually a man who doesn't have children, you ought to be working, but that fails to recognize the sort of reality that millions and millions of South Africans cannot find work in the economy. So that was a bit the setup before this sort of set the scene before COVID came, and then suddenly COVID comes, and this sort of tension within the social protection regime is rendered even more acute. So suddenly COVID shuts down the economy, literally overnight. There are already mechanisms in place through formal contributory, formal social insurance, and through the social grants that would continue paying out in some way to those people who are either formally employed or receiving social grants. There were mechanisms in place that could be leveraged to protect those people already, but those people in the gaps, the unemployed and those who are informally employed, were affected much more directly by the negative income shock of COVID, without the possibility of a social protection response from the government as the situation currently stood then. So just to set up a little bit of the scene. So Ihsaan, maybe do you want to take over and tell us a little bit about where our paper came in, what the precise ask from the policymakers that we were speaking to was, and tell us a little bit about the methods that we used to respond to that request.
Yeah, so it was a very practical mandate. The government knew that there would be a huge shift there was a huge impact on a particular proportion of the population, particularly as a result of the lockdown. the lockdown would mean that people couldn't go out to work anymore. And he knew that, well, formally employed people are covered by unemployment insurance fund. And that was, we didn't look at it, but as it turned out, that was pretty generous and that was fine. So if you're formally employed, you had some pretty good replacement of income. But for the informally employed in South Africa, of which, I mean, the informally employed constitute around 30% of all employed in South Africa. So we really talking about a third of all employed in South Africa, which is a huge number. They didn't, of course, by definition, they didn't have unemployment insurance. And so they would suddenly be prevented from working. And it was very strictly enforced, this lockdown. So the police were around checking, making sure nobody could, if you're informal, you absolutely could not even go around the law. So you had to stay at home. And that means, and the government knew that you can't put a third of people, take the income away of a third of people, of all employed, and expect nothing to happen. And so the ask was, can we do something to at least reach these people who are suddenly going to have a huge loss in income, including all their dependents? And so we were given, the ask was, in order to reach those people, we have the social protection systems that Rocco just spoke about. So we could look, and we specifically were thinking of the two biggest existing grants at the time, which is the child support grant, was distributed to about 12 million children. I think there were about 7 million kind of caregivers on behalf of 12 million children, and then something like 2.5 million pension. So much smaller coverage with the pension, but a much bigger amount, something like 6 or 7 times the amount of money that was given. And so the question was, can we, if we increase the CSG, the child support grant, or the old age pension, does that then reach the informal workers? Alternatively, can we come up with a new grant, which, an unemployment card, a COVID grant, something where we say anyone who's not employed can get it, and anyone who's not employed and who doesn't receive one of the other grants will be eligible for it. And that was the other option. So it was to use the existing grants or use this new grant. And so we did a very basic exercise where we used sort of, in South Africa, they're very lucky to have, through the kind of really hard and sort of visionary work of a lot of people that have worked in the space for a long time, very high quality data on households, including on their incomes and grants. And so we just performed a number of sort of simple simulations to say that if you take the households and their incomes and their grants, and you top up those incomes, or you give new grants to the people that are not employed and are not receiving grants, how much does the household income increase? And as a consequence, how much is poverty in the country affected? And of course, you do the various measures of poverty, and then you also sort of look at. So at the end of the day, it's sort of, we have three or four different combinations. We can increase the child support grant. We can increase the pension. We can increase this. We can create this new grant. We can do some combination of those. And the policymakers sort of asked us to do various combinations. And we basically, as a simulation, spat out sort of the numbers on what the effect would be on poverty. And as a just to cut it to the chase, we sort of recommended that the combination of the child support grant and the unemployment benefits, the unemployment grant, would be best, and we found that was most poverty reducing and very close to just the child support grant, but certainly much better than, for example, just the pension.
Yeah, great. And I suppose, the whole exercise is premised on the fact that we were working in a world of incredible uncertainty in a very information scarce environment. So a listener might wonder, well, wouldn't it be great if you had a registry of individuals or of households in the country, and you knew exactly who was informally employed, and then you could precisely target aid to those people who you knew with a high degree of probability would be affected by these lockdowns. So if you had a list of every individual in the population and what they do, then you could really be very precise in your targeting. Some countries have lists like this, and they were really lucky in COVID because they could use these lists very quickly to develop new social grants. We didn't have that luxury in South Africa. We didn't have a registry, and so what we needed to do was understand what would happen if we increased the value of grants in the way that Ihsaan you've described, or introduced a new social grant. And the nationally representative survey data that we had could allow us to say households who have informal workers. So we've got a good picture of a nationally representative picture of what households look like in the economy, and we could say households that have informal workers also tend on average to have social grant recipients of these kinds, or lack social grants recipients of these kinds. So I think implicit, in the whole exercise is that we don't have a sharp instrument here. What's the best that we can do using a very blunt instrument in a way that minimizes the trade-offs that I think we'll discuss now, which is we knew ahead of time that the money that would be paid to households through these grants we would be committing massive inclusion and exclusion errors. So what we mean by that is we would be sending money to households intending, from a policymaker's perspective, intending to reach people who'd been negatively affected by COVID, but some of that money would go to households who hadn't been negatively affected by COVID. And we would also miss some households who had been negatively affected by COVID. And I think this became a really interesting and almost philosophical discussion. Once you really start thinking about the normative assumptions that you're making when you do a policy exercise like this, which is, how much should we care about leakage, about these inclusion errors, about erroneously, quote unquote, giving money to households who weren't hit by the negative income shock, when those households are really not very economically well off in the first place? So when transfers are made through government coffers to households who are extremely deprived, but who weren't immediately affected by the shock, how much should we lament those errors versus how much should we lament inclusion errors of households who exclusion errors of missing households who really have been affected by the shock? And I think those sort of implicit assumptions, which we show in the paper, the implicit assumptions that you make in this policy exercise are really consequential for how you design an optimal policy package. So I mean, of course, interested listeners can go to the paper and look at this, but by tweaking these parameters and by really explicating some of these assumptions, these distributional assumptions, and thinking about how resources are shared within a household, we can really sort of, rather than deliver one policy prescription, one optimal policy prescription, deliver a menu of policy prescriptions to policymakers based on a range of different, normative claims, normative assumptions, and technical assumptions around how we assume resources are being distributed within the household. But I mean,
correct me if I just jump in there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think after this, you should tell us the story of the targeting being, why that actually became important. But just to jump on the sharing assumptions, it became really important because the child support grant typically went to women, because the mother of the child, overwhelmingly, because we had records of that. That meant that there was a sort of a very gendered element to this, in that there was an assumption, because we were saying, well, how do we affect household income, and therefore how do the household members benefit? If we give this extra top up to this mother, we're assuming that the mother is going to share the money across the household. And there is some evidence that mothers are kind of really good at that, especially relative to fathers who may or may also not be kind of absent completely or something like that. But on the other hand, it did mean that there was sort of again a sort of, in some way, systematically, men were being left out of this grant, and that's not, of course, without social consequence, especially where you have kind of such high unemployment. And so on the flip side of that, the unemployment grant itself, this new sort of what came to be the COVID relief of the stress grant, that actually tended to be more towards men than women. And people initially reacted to this saying, well, is this a sort of, it's a bit weird that this is a grant that actually favors men, because it's going more towards men. But mechanically, what was happening was that women, because you were only eligible if you didn't receive a grant, and more women received the child support grant, that meant that more men were getting. So I mean, it wasn't insanely imbalanced. It was something like 60-40%. But it did mean that those kind of household sharing assumptions became really important in reality.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and I think like when I was speaking now, you could imagine someone listening to technical assumptions about household sharing that's so removed from the actual policy debate. But I'm sure you remember, we were getting huge pushback from people at the highest levels of policy making in South Africa who were strongly biased towards increasing the value of the old age pension. And in fact, that bias prevailed because we recommended that the old age pension not be topped up, but it was sort of a non-negotiable that for very senior policymakers, that the old age pension be topped up. And the reason for this was that often these sort of older policymakers were very suspicious about how young women would spend the money that they were given through the grants. And I mean, these tropes are current at the highest levels of policymaking, and I think, and we saw that directly. These household sharing assumptions are very much alive in the policy space around social protection.
And in fact, if you go look at the kind of Department of Social Development, which tended to be much better on these things, they didn't buy into these sort of misconceptions nearly as much as the sort of some other departments. The DSD, the Department of Social Development, their reports would often kind of specifically have to labor this point. So like they include a section with grants say, oh, look, actually women do spend it mostly on food and not on wasting it away. So they're trying to put this point across, but I think this myth somehow very much has a lot of staying power.
Yeah. So let's speak about, you mentioned about discussions around leakage, targeting, and coverage. And I think in the paper we make a distinction between these three concepts. So we can think of, so when we talk about targeting, we think about the population that we want to reach who is affected by some shock. And in this case, the shock that we're concerned about is the COVID shock. Targeting is the effectiveness with which the policy option that we prescribe reaches those people. Coverage is a different concept, which is how many of those people that we want to reach who are affected by the shock are covered by the grant, by the policy option that we suggest. And I think this, so to put put these points into in a real life context that we had when we were engaging with policymakers. So we were in a meeting with some representatives of the Treasury, of the Presidency and Treasury, as well as and we also had at the table some other researchers at another university, or actually at the same university, but some other researchers who are doing a very similar exercise, who are asked to do a very similar exercise for prescribing a policy response to COVID. And there was no, they're completely well-intentioned and very strong researchers, but they had emphasized, I think without really thinking about the implicit assumptions here, they'd really emphasized targeting. And if you emphasize targeting, the leakage of the money that you spent to people who you didn't quote unquote want to reach becomes really really salient. And
just to briefly explain that point to listeners, the point here is that if, for example, if you look at an unemployment grant, and the only way you can distribute an unemployment grant is that you give it to anyone who is not formally employed and also doesn't have a grant. But in the South African context, where unemployment itself is so high, distinguishing between those who are unemployed and those who are informally employed is impossible because you don't have the records of that. And so therefore, the issue here is that when money was going to the unemployed rather than the previously informally employed, that was counted as leakage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I think the point that we try to make in the paper, which I think is really, really nice, which is that the consequences of leakage very much depend on where in the income or the consumption distribution that leakage accrues. So if leakage happens in a way that if leakage happens to those at the bottom of the income distribution, that is leakage of social grants in this case, mistakenly goes into the hands of the poorest members of society, we should worry about that less than if leakage goes into the hands of those at the top of the income distribution. And I think what we were able to show in the paper was that although there was massive leakage for all of the policy options that we prescribed, the leakage of these grants was massively, especially of the child support grant, was massively progressive. Actually, the new social relief distress grant wasn't particularly progressive, but it covered a lot of the people that would have been missed by any of the other grants. So those benefits sort of outweighed the leakage costs. But especially for top up of the child support grant, where we were missing people, we were hitting people who a social planner who's interested in welfare would want to hit anyway. So I think what we learned from that discussion was, what you choose to emphasize with policymakers in this case, and how you choose to frame questions really matters in terms of how appealing a particular policy option is. So, of course, expanding the old age pension would have had we would have committed fewer inclusion errors. We shouldn't really worry so much about those inclusion errors if we being progressive with how we spend the money anyway, and if we maximizing coverage of our target population. And that's sort of, I think, a message that comes out quite strongly from the work that we're doing, and I think has lessons more broadly for how we design social policy programs. And I've been thinking about this, in other work that I'm doing, not in the South African context. Myself and other researchers at the Center for the Study of African Economies, we working on social protection systems in the context of flood disasters. And when floods hit, you don't know perfectly who's been affected by a flood or who hasn't been affected by a flood. So there's, of course, you baked into the social protection systems that you design in response to those floods, you've got some tolerance for inclusion and exclusion errors. You're going to be giving money to people who weren't affected by floods, and you're going to be missing people who were affected by floods. And I think, rather than seeing those inclusion errors as straightforwardly failures of the policy, one really ought to consider, some of the distributional consequences of those, and where those inclusion errors are accruing, and how you design targeting approach that maximizes, welfare more broadly, and not just minimizes the damage of a particular shock. But yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to think about again, because in some ways we were overstepping our mandate as researchers, because the policymakers did have a certain mandate in mind, which was the targeting of the informal worker population. And I think we were right to emphasize that this progressive leakage is not the same as leakage to people that are completely wasting the money. But there are valid ways to think about it, where you do want to prioritize replacing income of the informally employed, and then maybe it becomes a question of weighting down different forms of leakage. Some leakage is not as bad as others, but it's still not as good as the targeted population. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously there are many more questions that one can ask.
Yeah, but I think, we were always transparent about the assumptions that we were
Absolutely,
making,
yeah.
the trade-offs
Yeah.
that would need to be made.
Yeah.
And if you're a policymaker
Yeah.
who prioritizes this, then that changes how you approach the problem.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things which I think was sort of interesting, is that it's not easy to, in doing policy work as an academic, I think one cannot simply accept a mandate from the policymaker and just implement something and only take direction. One does need to grapple with these sorts of questions. And when even if the policymaker, and in our case, the really excellent policymaker, Kate Phillip, was sort of on the same page as us in kind of all the time. So that was fantastic. But even in the case where the policymaker sort of is not on the same page as you, I think it really is, I felt, the duty of the researchers and us at the time to really think through all of these things properly, and to push back where we don't think it's right. I mean, of course, the policymakers' decision at the end of the day, because they're the democratically elected representatives that need to make these decisions. But we do have a different job to consultants, in that we do have some kind of responsibility to think about these broad issues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Before, when we were discussing this before we started recording, you spoke about we've spoken a lot about policy, but you also spoke about politics, and I wanted to ask you about this sort of relationship between research, policy, and politics in the context of what was a tumultuous year in South Africa.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about. To be honest, even though it's been 4 years. Wow. 4 years since then, it was I think for you as well, for all of us, a set of weeks that have really played on our minds ever since. And so one question is, to what extent do us as researchers actually have an effect on policy? And it seemed at the time that we had a huge effect, because literally the policymakers asked us to do a set of things. We produced a set of findings, and the policymakers then acted on that and put forward the grant. Now, of course, they would have put forward some sort of grant in any case, but I do genuinely think that our findings, which push them more towards a kind of child support grant, and basically they had a menu of options, and we pushed towards a certain subset of those options, and they did go for more or less that subset of options. So I do feel we did have an impact in that way. But subsequently, 6 months through, the harshest part of the lockdown was over, and the government, if anyone knows anything about the African economy right now, at least for the last 10 to 15 years, has been extremely stagnant in terms of growth. The government budget deficit has kind of blown up. There's huge worries, therefore, in terms of debt. In some ways, the government has run austerity budgets for many years now. And that means that sort of lockdown program of grants was enormously expensive and not something the government did want to take on, especially for a longer period of time. A 6-month horizon is a very different question to a permanent grant. A 6-month horizon can always be that it's a temporary loan, and that's not such a big deal from a government budget perspective. But a permanent grant is something that adds permanently to the deficit, and so that's very different. And so after 6 months, the government then said, well, we always told you this would be temporary, and so tried to sort of, announce that it would be withdrawn. And at that point, you can imagine, so it was being kind of, at that point, it was being distributed to about 20% of the population, about 10 million people out of 50, 10 out of 60 million people. And that's about a quarter of all adults. And so that's a huge deal that was being withdrawn. And so a lot of civil society really mobilized in response to that, held a number of sort of press conferences, petitions, marches, and so on, and petitioned the government to continue the grant. And after a lot of petitioning and sort of very real signs of sort of people being extremely upset, it was reinstated. And that first, it was reinstated for, I think, 2 months. But that continued. It happened again later. And again, the only thing that sort of brought it back was the social movements and social response to this. But still, sort of the social responses were decreasing over time. And so every time it would be delayed by 2-3 months and so on. And then the social response would be less. Until something like mid of 2021, if I recall correctly, it was sort of withdrawn properly. And so for the first time, the withdrawal actually came to place, whereas before, they'd announce a withdrawal, but then put it back in just before kind of the payment date was due. Now the payment date lapsed, and they didn't re-announce it. And 10 million people, for the first time in sort of a year and a half, including many of them sort of unemployed, didn't have a grant and was losing something like, at the time, which was 359 a month, but a substantial part of a very small amount of income. And one of the most, the biggest upheaval periods in the last decades in South Africa happened then. What is known as the July riots, where there were riots particularly across the province of KwaZulu-Natal, but also in Gauteng, so two very populous provinces, riots including the deaths of dozens of people during the unrest, including sort of vigilante sort of confrontations, people protecting their communities that were being, for example, looted of property and that sort of thing. It was an extremely intense time. Of course, it was not just the social relief of the stress grant withdrawal that was happening at the time. There were huge other political issues that were happening at the time. Most importantly, the kind of sending to jail of the former president, Jacob Zuma. But it was without a doubt a contributing factor that Zuma, who was going to jail, whether one could say that he called on, or that a huge amount of population were willing to riot, was without a doubt influenced by withdrawal of their income and the fact that they were left with nothing and no other choice. And this, in subsequent meetings, for example, that we had with Treasury, was said very directly that they knew at that point that withdrawing this grant is not just a matter of, it's going to save on the budget deficit, but it has extremely real consequences on social unrest, to the point that July riots was a point where some people thought we were not going to come back from that point. Were really extremely scary. It was, kind of a scale of unrest that I had never witnessed in my lifetime. And people were making sort of comparisons to sort of 1980s and 1950s as well, apartheid era sort of chaos. There was some really historic levels of unrest. And top Treasury officials at the time told us very directly that was the point at which we realized actually we can't withdraw this grant without having huge social consequences. And so at the end of the day, kind of, I think that the lesson from that for me was we did play sort of a crucial role in sort of the form it took and when it initially rolled out. But the staying power of that grant was very much up to the social forces that kept it in play.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like basic income by accident in a way, rather than by.
Yeah.
And I mean, I often thought about this, when discussing basic income in South Africa before COVID, which was, a lot of there have been social movements around a basic income grant, and there's also been a lot of academic work around basic income in South Africa, but there's never been the sort of groundswell of support for the policy that you would expect. But once it's there, it's almost impossible to take away. And I think, I mean, the social relief distress grant is still with us, and will probably still be with us for for the foreseeable future. I think we should wrap up soon. Let's. I've spoken a little bit about how this work has sort of bled into other work that I'm doing now, but I wonder if you could wrap up with the discussion of the links between this and the work that you're currently doing, especially I think around public employment and the trade-offs between a policy of social protection and employment, and how you see that evolving in South Africa.
Yeah, just very quickly, that one of the projects that came out of this was through, again, Kate Phillip, who was the sort of excellent bureaucrat that we were working with, very quickly sort of had this, ran up against this trade-off in the budget and saying that we have these grants that we can give out, but we also have this other system which is about sort of providing income to those who have no employment, which is public employment. And it's a very different sort of program, because obviously it's not a grant, but it's a much bigger amount. It can be productive to society, but sometimes it's not really as productive as one would like. It's much smaller in the number of people it reaches, but it's much more meaningful in that it gives proper work to people, for example, that are unemployed. And these sorts of questions become really important when one wants to think about what sort of social landscape does one want to support, and does one think a government should roll out in terms of a basic income versus public employment programs, public employment infrastructure, public employment provisioning. And I think those questions will stay with us for a very kind of long time, and they're really important questions, what the balance should be. But the specific project that we were working on were just in terms of, when you have these sorts of programs, they're also sort of, it's a sort of way that money reaches local communities, and then those local communities actually spend it. And that means that you have these income multipliers that are really important, because for the first time, there's sort of a multiplier happening at the bottom scale of the income distribution. In other words, areas that usually see no business or very little business and very little employment suddenly get an influx of money, and that could have huge multipliers. And some papers, which I think your colleagues have done, have said, these multipliers can be really important especially for poor economies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you're talking about Dennis Egger's work on.
Yeah.
Of course, and without inflationary pressures under certain contexts. So yeah, if listeners are interested to that, check out Dennis's mostly forthcoming work on this, which is excellent. Okay, let's wrap it up there. Ihsaan, has been so nice speaking to you again, and taking a trip down memory lane on this paper.
Thanks, Rocco.
Yeah, great. So to listeners, thanks for listening to the CSAE Research Podcast. We hope you'll join us again next time. If you want to listen to more episodes from the series, just go to the CSAE website.